1988. But getting back to the game of what was happening in 1912, Bernard Baruch financed two men. One of the men, which was a spoiler, and the other one to be elected, Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson, of course, was going to keep us out of war, wasn't he? But he made Bernard Baruch head of War Production Board. Bernard Baruch put $1,800 million worth of federal contracts through Baruch's own industries, netting himself over $400 million from personal after-tax profits. Not bad for uplifting downtrodden and taking care of the poor, you know. We'll get to, he'll come back later. I just thought we'd shoot that in while we had a few minutes here to waste. Let's see what else was happening in 1912, where the boys really playing the game really hot. Warburg personally writes a bill called the Federal Reserve Act to set up a private bank, privately owned. The Federal Reserve Bank is not owned by the government. And that private bank today owns your money. It isn't U.S. money. It's Federal Reserve Bank money. A private bank issues that money and controls all credit and all finances and the destinies of the people of the United States. Now, who was the first president of the Federal Reserve Bank? Mr. Warburg. Isn't that interesting? Well, we'll get to more later. Now, what was this? This was a monopoly bank to make sure that you dirty customers don't go from one bank to another and get a better deal. You were going to have the same interest rates, the same rediscount rates, and the same total control of the finances, and you customers are going to pay what you were told to pay. And all your credit and financing and your business success or failure is going to depend upon your financing from banks controlled by a central source. You see, you must combine them together in order to properly control them. By law. Only government can make out the edicts, right? Now we had a Federal Reserve Bank. Let's take a look. Well, we saw the First World War come along, and we won't get too much into the First World War. Let me see what else happened in 1913 of great importance. Well, that was a great year for events. But let's move on along to 1917. You see, the British opened the Dardanelles campaign, which purpose was to take away the oil fields from the Ottoman Empire and to deliver them to separate protectorates which could be controlled by, guess who? They did. Anyway, the problem was now Russia. What to do? In 1905, they tried a little show over there and it backfired. So they tried a new one. Here, Kerensky in May overthrew the Tsar. Lenin is sitting in Switzerland, unable to pay his room rent, can't even buy a sandwich, and all of a sudden, Max Warburg in Holland makes available to Lenin and deposits to his bank account $50 million in U.S. cash. While the German government, happy to ship Lenin to St. Petersburg, because you see, Lenin promised that if he overthrew Kerensky, he would sign a separate peace treaty in violation of the Allies' agreements and release German divisions from the Eastern Front to kill Americans on the Western Front, like Vietnam. So anyway, Lenin arrives, the Germans deliver him to St. Petersburg, and then a man, a bit Hollywood actor, leaves New York with two satchels of money. His name is Leon Trotsky, on the way to St. Petersburg. He is stopped by the Canadian government because they didn't want Trotsky getting to St. Petersburg financing Lenin, because if Trotsky got to St. Petersburg and Lenin was successful, Russia would withdraw from the war, releasing German divisions from the Eastern Front to kill Canadians in France. Not very smart, was it? So the Canadian government put Trotsky in jail and confiscated his money. But Woodrow Wilson put such pressure on the Canadian government, they were forced to release Trotsky, return his money, and ship him to St. Petersburg to finance the Russian Revolution, to sign the separate peace treaty of Brest-Litovsk, to release German divisions to go to the Western Front to kill Americans at Chateau Thierry and Belleau Wood. Just the same old game we get in Vietnam today, isn't it? Well, while that show is going on, let's move on to some other little things. 1922, Nobels are nicely knocked out, and things are coming along real good. By the way, 1920, let's take a look at now oil production. 1920, Washington oil production, 2.8%, under 3%. That took care of a competitor very nicely, didn't it? Lenin was doing his job, as he always was, a visible hireling. Stalin might have got a reasonable bit of independence, but Lenin was always a total puppet. Visibly so. For an example here, a couple of years ago, the president of Chase Manhattan Bank, which you would normally think of as a capitalist, wouldn't you? And something that communists would hate. And board of directors of Standard Oil, David Rockefeller, who should be number one hate man in the world of a communist. You would think so, wouldn't you? Where does he take his vacation? In the Kremlin. Isn't that the place where the number one capitalist should take his vacation? In the Kremlin? It's interesting, when his vacation is over, so was the term of Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev no longer was premier. Now I say this is just circumstantial. I can't prove there was a connection between the two events. But I think the boss arrived and didn't like what was going on at the outpost. And so we relieved the command and put new people in charge. Something made him unhappy. Well, anyway, let's go to 1922. Things start getting a lot of fun. In 1922, we had another pullout of money and another bank crash. The money was taken out to Canada again. We had another crash. By this time, notice what happened. A man named Will Durant, who owned a little company called General Motors, one of the wealthiest men in the world, in 6 months was wiped out, and the DuPonts moved in and took over GM. Pierre DuPont becoming president. Notice something. There are 1,600 millionaire DuPonts. That's a quiet sleeper outfit. And the ones you don't hear about much, watch them. If you notice in any political operation, the guy who doesn't do much talking, sits back to a cigar, really runs the show. The guy up front with a gavel, he's the puppet. What is really decided in the convention is decided the night before. The rest of you people who are delegates, you can kind of come and go along with the show. Because you got to have the eye watch for the public, don't you? Does anybody actually think that in any convention you really do pick the nominees? Quite absurd. But in 1922, the DuPonts took over GM. They almost got Ford Motor Company. Ford was back to the wall, and Henry, who was a real hard infighter, this is the old Henry, not that simpleton. New Henry hasn't got enough brains to really do anything. Outside, he's got enough money to, well, we'll leave Henry alone, I guess, for the time being. Maybe we'll get back to him later. Old Henry knew that they were ready to take Ford Motor Company. They had him in a box. He couldn't get out, just like they had Durant. Durant ended up slinging beer in a tavern in Flint, Michigan when he died the rest of his life, and he died there a poor man as a bartender. By the way, the big General Motors building in Detroit was originally, if you look up in the stonework, it's got a big D's in the stone. That was the Durant building. He just built that thing for his private office. A pretty huge operation. But Will Durant, they chiseled a lot of the D's off and made it the General Motors building. Anyway, what did Ford do? Ford swept up every bit of his plant, bought all the supplies he could on credit, built every car he could, ran out every lump of coal and every nut and bolt, laid all the workers off, sent them home, shut the plants down, shut the whole operation down, forced the dealers to buy every car for cash or lose their franchise. And cashed out the company, paid off all the debts of Ford Motor Company in one fell swoop, and opened the plant without a penny's worth of debt, and didn't borrow a penny as long as he was president of Ford Motor Company, till 1948. He never borrowed a cent from a bank in the world. In order to do his little banking that he had to do, remember Ford Motor Company is the only company in the world with a AAA credit rating. He opened his own bank, called the Wabaik Bank, to make sure that Manufacturers National. Wabaik was GM's bank. To make sure you wouldn't have to deal with any bankers in any of his operations. By the way, on his birthday in 1922, to show that he got away, he produced 100,000 cars as a birthday present to himself. All with no bank money. They pulled off the game at that time. They grabbed a few companies. But now the show shifted. They were in a new game. Let's watch the new game. It's called stock market. You know, you buy it, Parker Brothers, $2.98. Only they got a big model. It's called Wall Street. Watch this operation. They started buying stock at relatively low prices. The stock market wasn't an important thing up until the mid-1920s. In fact, in 1911, there were only 6 industrial companies even listed on the New York Stock Exchange. The rest were all utilities and railroads. They started buying at relatively cheap prices, large quantities of stock, and then some interesting things happened. In the human interest parts of our newspapers came advertisements, only they weren't listed as advertisements, but human interest stories. How this shoe clerk, now living at the Waldorf Astoria with a Stutz Bear cat and lots of gals in a raccoon coat, made all of his money in this magical thing called the stock market. Now, you just put 10% down. As the prices go up 10%, you make 100% profit. Magic! What an easy way to make money. Everybody's doing it. Prices are going up. There's a whole new boom, industrial boom, opening up with no limit, no horizon. Prices are going up, and you just invest 10% down, and you make 100% every time the market goes up, only 10%. Everybody's getting rich. Everybody's doing it. Everybody's buying. Nobody's selling. I want to tell you something. Somebody's selling for everybody buying. You see, I figured that one out. Now, watch the game now. What they did play down in these nice human interest stories is the fact that you also mortgaged your car, your life insurance, your house, and everything you owned. And if the market went down 10%, you lost 100%. And if it went down more than 10, you lost everything. Well, don't worry. It's all going up. See, don't let these little worries bother you. So the market goes up and up and up and up and up and up. And October 24th, 1929, every bank in New York withdrew all money from the stock market and from the money market. Interest rates went to 1,000% per day on short-term cash. That meant the stock market couldn't operate. As soon as this was announced, every broker knew what it was. The big boys had pulled the plug. They've sold out. So the brokers rushed on the floor trying to sell their stock. They wouldn't even answer the telephone for the num-nums out in the countryside. And of course, the window dives and the whole works. But somebody had sold all of that stock that had been bought by people, 10% down. But notice, who had the mortgages on the houses, on the cars, on the savings accounts, the insurance policies? Why, the very same boys. Now, they wouldn't have planned it that way, would they? Gee, golly. They wouldn't do that. So anyway, everybody wasn't buying. They were supposedly selling. Now, the market started down on October 24th, 1929. And by the way, that day arrived in the gallery on a visit from England, a man to witness the crash at the very hour of the crash named Winston Churchill. So he could be there for the show. I guess they wanted him to show him what power they had and brought him over for a little display. Be sure that he saw the game and knew where the marbles lay. Okay? So the American people got a little milking. But let's watch the game now. The market starts down October 24th. Now, the youth today are kind of told it crashed overnight. Well, it didn't crash overnight. It did for people with 10% down. But the market started on a steady decline until April 14th, 1932. On a steady decline, falling 95% to 5% of its previous level. Now, that's a pretty good fall, isn't it? It fell for 30 straight months. Why did it fall 30 straight months? Why were there no recoveries when prices looked cheap compared to old prices? Well, there were attempts at recoveries, but every night when the market would turn up, 3 men in the United States would pour across short sales, selling stock that didn't exist, putting up hundreds of millions of dollars worth of collateral behind these sales. And these men, you see a short sale, the person putting up the money is known. So therefore, the people really behind these sales could not be known. Otherwise, it would be known who was manipulating the market. These 3 men were obviously nothing but hirelings, people who didn't worry about their reputation. The man doing the major portion of the sale was the #1 bootlegger in the United States, the #1 gangster, the man who ran his own fleet of gunboats out of the 3-mile limit, who controlled the New York liquor market and the docks, a man named Joseph P. Kennedy. Old Joe wasn't worried about his reputation. He figured he'd buy that back later. You know? So old Joe was out there. By the way, he got his old liquor business back, didn't he? Remember when they took off Prohibition, he lost his liquor business, so now he got it legally. He got a total monopoly on all imports of all English British Isle liquors, Scotch, Welsh, Irish, and English liquors into the United States forever. He gets 25 cents a bottle on every bottle of liquor imported in the United States, no matter who imports it. How does he get that? By competition? By service? No. By government monopoly. That's where the Kennedy money comes from. Anyway, and he got that show back for doing a good, this was a payment for a good job well done in service of the right people. Oh, Joe knew where the thing was. Here was a hoodlum who came up and played with the right boys and pocketed his money. He was a smart guy, though. He knew never to socially himself muscle in. See, some of these people don't know that. This clique does not want you to muscle in socially. It's all right to work, it's all right to get some money and so forth, but and Lyndon Johnson knew that too. He knew how to keep a proper separation. But anyway, some of the boys don't, we'll talk about later. Let's see, October 14th, April 14th, 1932, it hit the all-time bottom. And this April 14th, 1932 was the lowest month of every economic indicator in the history of the United States, the very bottom of the Depression. Where was the second lowest month in the history of the United States? May 1938. That's an interesting date. Roosevelt had been president 5 years. But let's get back and see what happened. Enter stage left, Bernard Baruch. Bernard Baruch now financed another fellow for the presidency, a man named Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected, and after he is elected, before he took office, Bernard Baruch admits to Franklin Delano Roosevelt's son-in-law that he personally had bought 5/16 of all the silver in the world and held it in his private account. That's a third of the entire world's silver supply. The first act of Franklin Delano Roosevelt as president was to double the price of silver to help out Western miners. But Bernard was advising the president and was an elder statesman, which makes him an uplifter of the downtrodden. He was thinking of the nation's poor miners. You understand that? So, while we got that little show going, let's take a look at some other. You notice this history is a little different than you get down at the public school, doesn't it? In the 1930s and late 20s, a major oil producer was being developed in Mexico by independent oil companies. But in 1936, the president became a Mexico and El Presidente who was an avowed Marxist. He nationalizes an industry. You want to guess which industry he nationalized? You're right again. And Mexican oil production fell way off. But now let's jump along after the 1936 bit and watch some other show. You had a problem. Bernard Baruch was playing around with silver, but the other boys were playing with gold. All of the people here, I know we have been indoctrinated so heavy, and many of these things, they become emotional. I mean, names and personalities are something we've been indoctrinated to a point, oftentimes, we cannot even objectively look. To many people, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a god. I don't believe there's ever a politician who deserves anywhere near that kind of esteem. I'm sure of that. He was a man capable of all of the sins, shortcomings, and weaknesses the rest of us are. He didn't weigh much more. He didn't weigh as much as I did. And I'm sure that he was nothing but flesh and blood like everybody else. And just as easy enticed. Now, let's take a look and see what this man did. Now watch. You're told, and we're told, that gold is going overseas, aren't we? That there's a great outflow of gold. Where does gold go when it goes overseas? Oh, by the way, I didn't get to it. Let me digress for a minute. Back in 1919, the Rockefellers were setting up this little organization called the CFR. I told you about some of the presidential candidates. Well, it seems that every president of the Federal Reserve Bank since 1919 has been a member of the CFR. Of the executive committee of 5 men, 3 of them are Rockefellers. Now, the CFR also has members like the head of U.S. Steel, Blau, major heads of our college, major universities, and particularly the big giant industries, and very interesting in our State Department. Every Secretary of State since James Barnes, for an example, has been CFR. In fact, the CFR brags and can prove that our entire foreign policy is established by the CFR. because our State Department is in total control and has been since the Second World War in the hands of the CFR. Now, what is the Council of Foreign Relations' purpose? Their purpose is to bring about a one-world sovereign government. Now, let's understand what a one-world sovereign government means. If you are for a sovereign world government, you must be against sovereign national governments. You cannot have sovereign national governments and a sovereign world government. One must be sovereign or the other, but both cannot be sovereign. If you have sovereign states, you can't have a sovereign federal government. If you have a sovereign federal government, you can't have sovereign states. Sovereignty can only rest in one level. Sovereignty has to rest at some level. Therefore, if you are for a sovereign one-world government, a sovereign United Nations, you must be, therefore, against a sovereign United States. Seeing the Constitution of the United States establishes a sovereign United States, that's exactly what it does establish. Any person who is for a sovereign one-world government is for the overthrow of the Constitution of the United States. Richard Milhouse Nixon says he is for the sovereign United Nations. This means he is for the overthrow of the Constitution. Lyndon Baines Johnson says he is for the sovereign United States. Dwight David Eisenhower was for a sovereign United Nations. I said, I think I got Johnson backward, didn't I? He was for a sovereign United Nations. Truman for a sovereign United Nations. This means that they are idealistically committed to the overthrow of the Constitution of the United States. They were elected to be president, not of the United Nations. They were elected and hired to a job by the American people to be president of the United States. Being for a sovereign United Nations is grounds of impeachment alone under law. Let's take a look at some other things. Up here on the top of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which is the Federal Reserve Bank as far as we're concerned, because that bank is the controlling bank of the national banking system, there is up here in the office a man, president of the Federal Reserve Bank, who happens to be also CFR. Now, across the street, there's another bank called Chase Manhattan, where David Rockefeller on the board of the CFR sits. Now, the foreign banks hold their gold deposits. They don't take them out of this country because you might lose them, they might sink and all this other thing. What they do is they have bank accounts or vaults in the basement of Chase Manhattan. When gold goes to England, it goes out of the basement of Federal Reserve Bank, across the street, and down into the Chase Manhattan base. When gold goes to France, it goes out, across in the France vault. Sweden, it goes out. Now the government doesn't own the gold. The banks own the gold. Got it? It isn't going to foreign governments. It's going to foreign somebodies. Okay? Now, this basement is considered not in the United States by law. When you have a law against holding gold in the United States, that doesn't count for gold in the basement of Chase Manhattan. Okay? Now, nowadays, because people used to count the gold carts going across the street, they dug a tunnel. You can't count it anymore. You don't even know where the gold is going across the street. They just say it went through the tunnel, see? Okay. Now, gold goes overseas. Oh, it's going overseas. You see, all our gold going overseas at $20 an ounce in 1932. You seen the game being played? Oh, watch the game. The gold is going across the street, and our president gets on the radio, and he says, "My dear friends, you see, there are starving babies in this nation. Tears. They're hungry. Millions are out of work. And the reason for that is a lack of confidence in our dollar. Because gold is going overseas. It is a lack of confidence that is causing the hunger and the pain and misery of our nation." More tears. I therefore, the President of the United States, ask you, the patriotic people of America, if you will loan your gold for 90 days to the government of the United States under the solemn promise of the President of the United States, band music, to return your gold, and I will present you with a written promise of the return of that gold in 90 days. The American people flags are waving, saluting, gold in hand, go down to their bank and lend it on the promise of the President of the United States, who would never lie. 95% of all the gold held in the United States was voluntarily taken down and lent to our government on the solemn promise that in 90 days it would be returned. Then the President had a law passed that said that you dirty people, if you ask for your gold back, you go to jail. After he had the gold. He didn't pass that one first. Oh, no. After they had the gold. Now, where was the gold going? Why, it was going across the street into the basement of Chase Manhattan at $20 an ounce. That's what you got for it, right, when you turned it in. 20 paper dollars. And then the President says, started fluctuating the price of gold and settled it at 35. The gold came back across the street with a nice 14 thousands of millions of profit. The price increase in gold. Of course, you dirty American people weren't supposed to get that awful profit. That was bad for you, wasn't it? Somebody got it. Somebody got the profit. Now notice something. They said everybody lost in the stock market crash. Ask yourself a question. If everybody lost, that's impossible. For everybody lost $1, somebody made $1. Who made the dollars? You're not supposed to ask those questions, are you? You see, us Birchers, we keep asking these awful questions, and that's the reason why we should shut up and let the thing go along peaceful its own way. We keep agitating by asking these awful questions. They're embarrassing. Now, who got the dollars? Who picked up the mortgages on the houses, on the insurance policies, on the bank deposits? Who picked it up? Ask yourself a question. The people who lent the money on the margins on the stock. Now they got the gold. Now they didn't have enough. They want something more. This is only a 60-day little operation, you know. Now that you had that little thing cleaned up, you got your money back for your investment in the new president. We have to do something else. Now you've got a bunch of billions that are laying around in paper, don't you? You've got to do something with it. You have to have your assets out earning money. You don't want them laying around earning nothing. So what do you want to do? Well, they decided, let's put it into factories. But now if you start putting hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars investing in American industry, what would happen?